She caught her husband with his mistress while 7 months pregnant, but instead of falling apart, she rose. Through heartbreak, legal battles, and the birth of her daughter, Claire found strength she never knew she had. What began in betrayal became a story of resilience, sisterhood, and a new kind of love. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Subscribe now for more stories that prove even shattered hearts can rebuild stronger. I didn't plan to come home early that day. It was just one of those small accidents, the kind you barely notice in the rush of morning chaos. I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter, wedged between a half-eaten granola bar and the opened mail I never got around to. That little oversight would crack open everything I thought was solid. Funny how life works. Not with earthquakes or explosions, but with quiet things. Forgotten phones, unfamiliar laughter, doors left half open. My name is Claire Maddox. I'm 32 years old, 7 months pregnant, and until that afternoon, I thought I was happily married. I was on my way to Crestview High, where I'd taught English for 8 years. I loved my students, especially the quiet ones who hid poetry in the margins of their notebooks, or the loud ones who laughed too hard during Shakespeare. That day was supposed to be simple. Poetry club in the afternoon, feedback sessions before the semester break. Then I'd head home, microwave something vaguely nutritious, and grade essays until my back begged for mercy. But about halfway through the parking lot, I realized something was off. No vibrations, no emails, no calendar ping reminding me about prenatal yoga. I told myself it wasn't worth the drive. But there was this voice in my head, low and persistent. You should check. The streets on the way home were glazed in late October sunlight, trees half bare, their golden leaves skittering across the pavement like they were running from something. My house, forest green shutters, sloped porch, hanging fern still alive against all odds, looked the same as always, but something felt off. A black Lexus sat across the street, sleek, polished, definitely not from our neighborhood. I'd seen it before, at Marcus's office party a few months ago, but couldn't place it then. I didn't try to now. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the wine glass on the counter. Not mine. Marcus had never liked reds, said it gave him heartburn. This one, half-empty lipstick-stained Cabernet maybe, looked like it had been sipped slowly, purposefully. The air held a faint trace of perfume, something floral and artificial, like gardenia candles or cheap body spray. Then I heard it. A laugh, high-pitched. Young. Not mine. The blood in my ears roared louder than the voice that whispered, "Don't go up there." But I went anyway. 1 step, 2. Each creaking stair, another crack in the life I thought was mine. My daughter, yes, I already knew it was a girl, shifted inside me, pressing low against my ribs like she knew the truth before I did. The bedroom door was ajar. Sunlight filtered through the curtains and hit the floor in wide gold bands. I could have turned back. I should have. But I didn't. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed, shirt unbuttoned, hair a mess. His hands rested on the hips of a woman straddling him, Belle Adams. She used to work under him, in every sense of the phrase, apparently. Her blouse was open, her lipstick smeared, and it was the same shade I had complimented at last month's company mixer, back when I was still naive enough to believe that being a good wife meant applauding your husband's coworkers. Marcus looked up. Shock hit his face like a splash of cold water. "Claire," he choked. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just stood there with one hand over my belly, the other gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing anchoring me to earth. Belle had the audacity to smirk. Not apologize, not even look sorry. Just smoothed her skirt like I'd caught her running late, not ruining my marriage. "How long?" I asked. Marcus opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Belle answered for him, all sweet venom. "Does it matter? You've been growing apart for a while, right? He needs someone who can keep up with him, not someone folding laundry and planning baby showers." The baby kicked hard. My daughter was protesting, or maybe reminding me I was still here, still breathing, still strong. "Don't," I said when Marcus took a step toward me. "Don't touch me." I turned and walked out, just like that. No fight. No dramatic farewell. Just the soft tread of my boots on hardwood, past the wine glass in the mail, and the photo on the hallway table from our honeymoon in Cape Cod. I didn't take anything but my keys. The wind hit me like a slap when I stepped outside. Cold and crisp and filled with the smell of wet leaves and something final. I sat in the car and rested both hands on the steering wheel. The truth burned behind my eyes, but I didn't cry. Not yet. Not until I'd pulled out of the driveway. Not until the house disappeared in my rearview mirror. That was the last time I stepped foot in the place I used to call home. I didn't know where to go, no friends I could call. I distanced myself without meaning to over the past few years. Life, work, Marcus. He became the center of everything. My fault. I saw the signs and still convinced myself they were shadows, not storm clouds. So I drove to the one place I knew no one would find me, an old motel off Route 9. They didn't ask questions at check-in, just slid me a key to room 6B and told me to let them know if I needed extra towels. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and faded carpet. The walls were thin, the comforter scratchy, and the window overlooked the parking lot. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My heart pounded like I'd run a mile. Only then did the tears come. I cried for my daughter who would never see her parents as I once dreamed they'd be. I cried for the woman I'd been, trusting, tired, too loyal. And I cried because I knew the worst wasn't over. I still had to tell someone. So I reached for the motel phone, hands trembling, and dialed the only number that mattered, one I hadn't used in over a year. "Hello?" a voice answered, sharp, professional, familiar. "Victoria," I whispered. Silence. Then, softer. "Claire?" My voice cracked. "I need help." Another pause. Then the sound of paper rustling, keys clinking. "I'm coming. Where are you?" That was the moment something shifted. Something old and long buried cracked open between us, and for the first time in hours, I didn't feel entirely alone. Not yet safe, but not alone. It had been 27 minutes since I made the call. I'd counted every second. The phone still sat in my hand like a lifeline and a weight all at once. The motel room's flickering wall sconce hummed faintly, its light casting long shadows across the laminate floor and faded floral wallpaper. I kept expecting my chest to stop hurting, to breathe normally again, but the ache stayed. Deep. Dull. Like a bruise that hadn't surfaced yet. Then, just as I'd started to question if I'd imagined the conversation entirely, I heard it. A knock. 3 steady raps on the door. I froze. A part of me, the shattered part, imagined Marcus standing outside, regret bleeding from his eyes, holding out flowers and apologies wrapped in lies. But it wasn't him. I opened the door, and there she was. Victoria. My sister hadn't changed much since the last time we saw each other. 18 months ago, Thanksgiving, the one that ended in slammed doors and silent months. She still had that perfectly cut blazer, her hair in a sleek ponytail that no wind could ever muss. But her eyes, those steel blue eyes, softened the moment they saw me. Without a word, she stepped inside, holding a bag from that old diner we used to love as kids. The smell of warm chicken soup hit me like a memory. She looked around the room, then at me. I must have looked like a ghost. My hair a tangled mess, eyes swollen, lips cracked from crying. "You look like hell," she said. I laughed. It came out broken, but it was a laugh. "You came," I whispered. "I'll always come," she replied, her voice low. She placed the bag on the nightstand and turned to face me fully. "What happened?" And just like that, the dam burst. I told her everything. The lipstick, the laugh, the wine glass, Belle, Marcus's face, my own silence, my feet moving on their own, the baby kicking as if reminding me I wasn't alone. I told her how I didn't scream. I didn't fall to my knees. I just left. And it didn't feel brave. It felt hollow. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, not interrupting once. She didn't gasp or try to fix it. Just listened with that unnerving stillness she'd mastered since we were kids. When I finished, the room was silent. Then she stood up, took a spoon from the bag, handed it to me, and said, "Eat something before you pass out." It was the most loving thing she could have done. I ate in slow, quiet bites, the broth scalding my throat, grounding me back into my body. She stood at the window, arms crossed, staring out at the parking lot like she could will the world to stay still. Finally she spoke. "He cheated on you while you were carrying his child in the house you built together." I nodded, my eyes stinging again. "I always thought Marcus was a fraud," she added flatly. I looked up, startled. "You never said that." "You were in love," she shrugged. "And I thought maybe I was wrong. Turns out I was just polite." There was no anger in her voice, just this clear, razor-sharp logic that had always made her a terrifyingly good negotiator and a lousy person to cry to. But somehow tonight, that tone comforted me more than any gentle words ever could. She wasn't treating me like I was broken. She was treating me like someone who'd been wronged and deserved justice. After dinner, I lay on the bed while Victoria made a list on her phone. That's what she did when she didn't know what else to do. Tasks made her feel like the world was manageable. When we were kids and our dad walked out, she coped by organizing the cereal by sugar content. Now she made action plans. I watched her fingers fly over the screen. "You're coming home with me," she said without looking up. "What about your schedule? Your routine?" I asked. "Less important than you," she replied, matter of fact. "And I cleared out the guest room months ago. I just didn't think you'd actually use it." My throat tightened. "You were waiting?" "I was hoping," she said. I started to cry again. Softly this time. Not like earlier, when it had been heaving and ugly. This cry was quieter, deeper, like mourning something sacred. My marriage, my trust, my version of forever. Victoria sat beside me, stiff at first, unsure. But then she put her arm around my shoulders and I leaned into her, and we just sat there like that for a while. Her blazer smelled like lavender and control. I didn't say thank you. She didn't say I'm here. It was understood. Later that night, after brushing my teeth with a tiny travel kit from the motel's front desk and changing into the clean t-shirt Victoria had brought, I lay in bed staring at the popcorn ceiling. Victoria had claimed the single armchair, legs crossed, phone still in hand, researching family lawyers. "You ever heard of Daniel Reeves?" she asked, without looking up. "No," I said. "He's sharp, discreet, used to be a prosecutor, switched to family law after his sister went through a nasty divorce. He takes clients by referral only." "And how do you know him?" "I play squash with his paralegal." Of course she did. She set her phone down and looked at me. "He'll help you get out clean. You deserve a clean break." I nodded, but my stomach twisted. This isn't how I thought my life would go. "Claire," she said with a rare gentleness, "nobody dreams of being betrayed, but you are not the sum of what Marcus did. You're still you." "Am I?" I whispered. "Because right now I feel like a shell." She leaned forward, taking my hand. "You're not a shell. You're a mother, and mothers don't break. They bend, they bleed, but they don't break." I didn't reply. I just let the weight of her words settle. Sometime past midnight, after Victoria had dozed off in the chair, her chin tucked to her chest, I reached for the notepad by the motel phone. My hand trembled as I wrote, "Dear baby girl." I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know how to explain to her that the man I loved had chosen someone else, that the home I built had crumbled in a single afternoon. But I knew I had to start, because she would one day ask. And when she did, I wanted to give her more than silence. I wanted to give her truth. I wanted to give her strength. And maybe, someday, even peace. Victoria's townhouse smelled like rosemary and lemon wood polish, the kind of scent that makes you feel like everything's under control. It was sleek, modern, with furniture arranged at perfect right angles and not a single picture frame tilted. Everything had a place, except me. I stood just inside the foyer, clutching the duffel bag Victoria had tossed together from the motel. She was already at the kitchen island, unpacking a brown bag filled with groceries labeled organic and prenatal approved. My eyes scanned the space. The guest room was down the hall. The nursery untouched from when Victoria had planned to foster 2 years ago, plans she'd shelved after her last breakup. I wondered if that was why she hadn't redecorated it yet. She didn't talk much that morning, just moved through her tasks like a surgeon in an operating room. Swift, sterile, exact. I appreciated it. Talking hurt, existing hurt. "You've got an appointment with the lawyer at 3 she finally said, sliding a cup of decaf tea toward me. "Daniel Reeves. He's good, smart. More importantly, he's blunt." I wrapped my fingers around the mug, grateful for the warmth. "Do I have to tell him everything?" "No," she said, "but you'll want to." Daniel Reeves was not what I expected. When we pulled up to his office in downtown Portland, I imagined a sterile room, walls covered in degrees, a man in a stiff suit behind a colder desk. What I got was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a gray streak running through his dark hair like a bolt of experience. He stood when we entered and offered a hand, firm but not forceful. "Claire," he said, like he already knew me. "Victoria's told me a bit. I'm sorry for what brings you here." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I didn't want pity, but something about his eyes told me he wasn't offering that. He was offering focus. We sat in a sunlit room with windows that overlooked a small garden courtyard. There were no degrees on the walls, no diplomas flaunted. Just art, abstract lines like motion captured mid-sentence. It felt personal. That surprised me more than anything. Daniel opened a yellow legal pad and clicked his pen once. "You don't need to share everything today, just what you're ready to. But I need a picture of the assets, the relationship history, and anything you believe could impact custody or safety." The word safety made me flinch. Victoria spoke up. "He showed up at the motel after she left. Pounded on the door. Didn't get violent, but it was enough." Daniel nodded and made a note. "That matters." I took a breath and began. Told him how Marcus and I met in college, how we'd built a life together on what I thought was shared ambition, love, goals. I talked about our house, how it was in both our names, but Marcus handled the mortgage and most of the finances. I'd contributed. My teaching salary went into our joint account, but he always dismissed my questions. He said he'd handle the hard stuff, I murmured, embarrassed. Said I worried too much. Daniel looked up. "In your classroom, if a student turned in a story with one character controlling all the finances and deflecting questions, what would you say?" "That they were hiding something," I said. He didn't smile, just nodded and jotted that down. I told him about Belle, the lipstick. The way Marcus looked relieved when I walked out, like I'd done the hard part for him. I even told him about the baby, about the kick I felt when the betrayal settled into my bones like frost. Daniel didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back. "You have more rights than you think. Oregon follows equitable distribution. We'll get a full financial picture. Joint accounts, retirement, investments, property. We'll freeze anything that's at risk, and we'll draft a temporary custody and support agreement before the baby arrives." His tone was calm but unyielding, like granite. "I don't want to hurt him," I said suddenly, surprising myself. Victoria rolled her eyes. "Claire, I just want to move on," I added quickly, "to protect my daughter, not destroy him." Daniel studied me for a long beat. "That's not weakness, it's clarity, and it will serve you well in court." He handed me a list. Documents to gather, accounts to check, even a journal to start logging interactions with Marcus in case he pulled something unpredictable. At the bottom of the list, scribbled in smaller handwriting, was a note. "You are not your pain. You are your power." I didn't know it then, but I would keep that slip of paper tucked in my journal for months. That night, back at Victoria's, I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room and stared at the mural on the wall, soft watercolor trees stretching into the sky. I imagined reading to my daughter there, rocking her to sleep under that painted forest. I imagined peace. Victoria walked in holding a basket of folded laundry. "I'm not fragile," I said, before she could say anything. She didn't miss a beat. "I know, but even iron rusts when it rains too long. Doesn't mean it's weak, just means it's time to dry off and coat up." I chuckled. "That's not how metaphors work." "It is in this house," she replied. She handed me a small box. Inside was a phone, brand new, preloaded with Daniel's number, mine, the locksmith, and a grocery app. I blinked. "You got me groceries?" She smiled, and it reached her eyes this time. "You're growing a human. It's the least I could do." Later, as I lay under the quilt, my hand resting on the swell of my belly, I felt a shift, not in my situation, not in my pain, but in my spine. I was no longer waiting to be saved. I was preparing to fight smart. For my daughter, for my dignity, for the version of myself I'd nearly lost. The one who always found meaning in stories, even the painful ones. And I was finally ready to write a new chapter. The first sign that something was wrong came from the dog. Victoria's neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hanley, owned a golden retriever that rarely barked. But that Thursday morning, as I was pouring warm oatmeal into a chipped ceramic bowl, I heard a sudden frenzy of barking outside the townhouse gate. Sharp, frantic, and unrelenting. I walked to the window, spoon still in hand, and there he was, Marcus. He stood at the bottom of the front steps in his crisp gray coat, shifting from foot to foot like he was deciding whether to knock or run. I froze. The bowl clattered into the sink, oatmeal splashing onto my shirt. My hand instinctively shot to my belly. The baby kicked hard, sensing my fear before I could name it. I backed away from the window just as he rang the bell. The chime cut through the silence like a blade. "Claire?" he called. Claire, I know you're in there. Victoria appeared almost instantly. She didn't shout, didn't panic. She just walked over, grabbed her phone, and dialed. Daniel, she said calmly. He's here. Yes, right now. I stared at her, wide-eyed. How did he find me? She raised a brow. He didn't. He followed someone in, probably caught the gate behind another car. He won't get inside. My breath came fast. I felt 12 again, helpless, cornered. I can't face him. Not like this. You don't have to. The intercom buzzed again. Claire, please. I need to talk to you. This is all a misunderstanding. The word hit me harder than I expected. Misunderstanding. As if I'd hallucinated the lipstick, the open blouse, the way he didn't even flinch when I left. Let me handle it. Victoria said. No, I whispered. Let Daniel. 15 minutes later, Daniel arrived like some kind of quiet storm. Suit slightly rumpled, expression unreadable. He nodded at the concierge, asked a few quick questions, and then made his way up to us. He's still outside? He asked. Yes, Victoria replied. Daniel turned to me. Claire, you don't have to speak to him, but you should decide how this moment plays out. This will set the tone. I hesitated. If I talk to him, he'll think it's an opening. Then don't talk, he said simply, but don't hide either. His words grounded me. I nodded. We stepped out onto the townhouse balcony, Victoria to my right, Daniel to my left. Marcus looked up instantly. His face lit up as if this were a reunion, not a reckoning. Claire. Thank God. His voice carried through the cold air. A few heads turned from the sidewalk. A car slowed. Go home, Marcus, I said. I can't, he said, taking a step closer to the gate. Not until you hear me out. Belle was a mistake. I ended it. I fired her. You're trespassing, Daniel interrupted, voice firm. Marcus blinked. Who the hell are you? Her attorney, Daniel said, unshaken. You're not to contact her directly again. All communication goes through me. Marcus scoffed. Attorney? Come on, Claire. Is this really necessary? I stepped forward. Yes, it is. I'm the father of your child. And that child, I said, voice shaking but steady, deserves to be raised by someone who respects their mother. You forfeited that when you brought her into our bed. Claire, please. His voice cracked. And for the first time, I saw it. Fear. Not regret. Not love. Just the realization that I wasn't coming back. Security arrived then, 2 uniformed guards walking with slow, certain steps. Marcus's eyes darted between them, Daniel and me. Mr. Maddox, one of them said, we're going to have to ask you to leave. You've been flagged as a restricted guest. This is my wife, he protested. No, I corrected. I'm Claire. That's it. He looked at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. And maybe I wasn't the woman he remembered. Maybe he'd underestimated what betrayal does to a person. It doesn't just break them, it sharpens them, rebuilds them, makes them steel. He finally turned and walked away. Victoria shut the balcony door gently behind us. Inside, I collapsed into the nearest chair. My hands trembled. Daniel crouched in front of me. I want to file for a temporary restraining order, he said. It protects you and establishes a pattern of behavior. Isn't that a bit extreme? I whispered. He looked me straight in the eyes. What's extreme is him showing up, uninvited, unannounced, outside your home while you're pregnant. This isn't about punishment, it's about protection. Victoria chimed in from the kitchen. And it creates a legal trail. It matters. I nodded, slow at first, then faster. Do it. Daniel stood. We'll also file for emergency support, freeze the joint accounts, and transfer medical decisions. You'll need a new bank account. He can't have access. For the first time, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt ready. That night, I sat on the guest bed, knees pulled up, writing in my journal again. Dear baby girl, today your father tried to barge back in, not with fists, with words, with old memories. But he doesn't get to own your story. He doesn't get to decide what safety means for us. I don't know how this ends yet, but I know one thing. He will never have to question whether you were worth fighting for. The next morning, Daniel returned with the paperwork. I signed it all. Restraining order, custody petition, financial freeze, with hands steadier than the day before. Victoria made tea and paced like a general preparing for battle. After Daniel left, she sat beside me and held my hand for a long time without saying anything. Thank you, I whispered. She squeezed once. You're doing this, Claire. You're not surviving, you're building. And maybe for the first time since that day in the bedroom, I believed her. I wasn't broken. I was becoming. The courthouse felt colder than I expected. Not just in temperature, but in tone, in air, in the way every footstep echoed too loudly down marble hallways. Daniel walked beside me, holding a leather folder under one arm and a thermos of peppermint tea in the other. Victoria trailed behind, her heels clicking with purpose, but her presence more sister than soldier today. She hadn't said much since we left the townhouse, just offered me her signature navy blazer and a steadying hand as I buttoned it over my maternity dress. "Power colors," she'd said. I didn't argue. We stopped just outside courtroom 3B. The double doors loomed tall, hair carved with years of solemn decisions and final rulings. I stared at them like they were going to swallow me whole. "Claire," Daniel said, gently placing the thermos in my hand, "you're not here to win or lose. You're here to protect what's yours. Nothing more." "What if I freeze up?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "Then you take a breath," he said, "and we start again." The doors opened. My heart stuttered. Marcus was already inside, sitting beside his attorney, a woman in her 50s, stiff posture, sharp lipstick, and the sort of expression that made you feel like she could read your sins before you spoke. Marcus was dressed like the man I married, polished, groomed, professional. But his eyes, they were wrong, wild, panicked beneath the surface, like he knew control was slipping from his fingers. I sat beside Daniel, clutching the armrest like it might keep me tethered. Victoria chose a seat behind me, but I could feel her energy pressing forward, willing me to stand tall. The judge entered, robes sweeping the air, and the courtroom stood. Judge Monroe was a woman, older, with gray streaks in her hair and the no-nonsense tone of someone who had seen far too many cases just like mine. She greeted the room with a nod and asked for opening statements. Daniel rose first. "Your Honor," he began, his voice even, clear, "we are seeking temporary custody, spousal support, and a restraining order renewal. We present evidence of infidelity, financial opacity, and an unannounced visit that left my client, who is 7 months pregnant, in a state of fear and distress." The judge turned to Marcus's lawyer. "We dispute the necessity of a restraining order," she said crisply. "My client acknowledges an extramarital affair, which has since ended. He asserts a desire to reconcile and remain involved in his child's life." I felt bile rise in my throat. The word reconcile hit like a slap, as if love was a faucet he could just turn back on. Then the judge looked at me. "Miss Maddox, would you like to speak?" My legs wobbled as I stood. Daniel offered a subtle nod. I didn't look at Marcus. I kept my eyes on the judge, on the empty chair beside her, on the silence waiting to be filled. "I'm not here for revenge," I said. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here because I need to protect my child." The room was silent. I spent the last 5 years building a life with someone who promised to show up, who told me I could trust him. And then when I was at my most vulnerable, he chose someone else, not just once, over and over. I swallowed. When I came home and saw him with her, I didn't scream. I didn't break things. I walked away. I protected my daughter the only way I knew how, by leaving. I paused, my hand resting on the swell of my belly. She hasn't been born yet, but she already deserves better. The judge's gaze didn't waver. She nodded slightly. "Thank you, Miss Maddox." I sat down, my knees nearly buckling. Marcus was called to speak next. He cleared his throat, eyes darting toward me. "I made a mistake," he said, "and I've apologized for it. Claire and I had been drifting for a long time. The affair wasn't about love. It was about confusion. Loneliness." Judge Monroe held up a hand. "Mr. Maddox, this is not the time for justifications. This is about safety, stability, and the child's best interest." Marcus's attorney stood, quickly pivoting the tone. "My client would like regular visitation once the child is born. He has means, a stable home, and intends to support both mother and child financially." Daniel rose again, presenting evidence. Copies of texts between Marcus and Belle, financial inconsistencies in their joint account, and the police report documenting his unannounced appearance at the townhouse. The judge reviewed the papers silently. Then she spoke. "This court grants Miss Maddox full temporary custody and financial support. The joint account is to be frozen pending full disclosure of all assets. A temporary restraining order is extended for 30 days, with a review scheduled at the next hearing." She looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Maddox, your actions, both past and recent, demonstrate a pattern of disregard for emotional stability. This ruling is not a punishment. It is protection." The gavel struck. It was done. As the courtroom emptied, I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Victoria came to my side, squeezing my shoulder. "You did good," she whispered. "It didn't feel good," I murmured. "No," she said, "but it was right." Marcus didn't speak to me as he passed by. He didn't even meet my eyes. And that hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted him to, but because it confirmed what I hadn't let myself accept until that moment. He was already gone. We stopped at a small tea house down the block, the kind of quiet place with mismatched mugs and sleepy jazz in the background. Daniel ordered for all of us, and we sat at a corner table near the window. Victoria was texting, probably coordinating something 5 steps ahead. Daniel set a paper napkin under my cup and finally spoke. "You were composed, clear, and dignified," he said. "That's rare." It didn't feel rare. It felt like survival, I admitted. He nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Outside, the trees shook loose another wave of golden leaves. I watched them fall, spiraling like pieces of something I used to believe in. When the tea arrived, I lifted the cup with both hands. This wasn't the ending I planned, but for the first time it felt like a beginning I could live with, maybe even grow into. 2 weeks had passed since the court hearing, and I was back at Crestview High, standing just outside the teacher's lounge, with a travel mug in one hand and my other instinctively resting on my belly. 7.5 months pregnant, wearing a blazer over a maternity dress that no longer buttoned at the bottom. I'd rehearsed this return in my head 100 different ways. How I'd walk in, how I'd smile, how I'd pretend everything was fine. But standing here now, just one door away from familiar faces, I wasn't sure I could pull it off. Then I heard it. Laughter inside, someone groaning over a printer jam, the whir of the ancient coffee machine in the corner that always sputtered out lukewarm bitterness. The world hadn't stopped just because mine had. I stepped inside. The room didn't freeze, exactly, but it shifted. Like everyone had just remembered they were supposed to act normal. Katie Marshall, my fellow English teacher and longtime hallway ally, looked up from her yogurt and offered a tight smile. "Claire," she said, standing a little too fast. "Hey, welcome back." "Thanks," I replied. "Here." She opened her arms like she wanted to hug me, then paused. "Can I?" I nodded, and just like that, the room exhaled. A few more teachers offered soft welcomes. Someone handed me a granola bar. A substitute gave up her seat without being asked. It wasn't pity, it was something gentler. Recognition, maybe, or quiet respect. I sat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I sipped coffee in a room full of chatter without my pulse racing. Principal Roberts came in a few minutes later. A good man, mid-50s, father of 3, always smelled vaguely like cinnamon gum and optimism. "Claire," he said, approaching. "We're glad you're back. Are you sure you're ready?" I looked around at the bookshelves filled with dusty reference guides, the posters about fire drills, the bulletin board with cartoon apples and Teacher of the Month photos. "I need this," I said honestly. "I need my students, my classroom. I need something that still feels like mine." He nodded. "If you need time, just say the word. I'll let you know." Later that morning, I stood in front of my sophomore lit class and stared at the open textbooks before me. We were finishing the Scarlet Letter. A fitting coincidence, given my current life arc. I cleared my throat. "So," I began, "when Hawthorne wrote about shame, he wasn't writing about sin. Not really. He was writing about what society does to people it doesn't understand, people who step out of line, intentionally or not." A few students looked up, surprised by my tone. "Good. Let them listen." Hester Prynne wore her Scarlet Letter on her chest. All of us carry ours somewhere. Maybe not sewn onto fabric, but stitched into memory, tucked behind our ribs. I paused. And sometimes surviving is the act of defiance. A girl in the front row, Jordan, smart, a little too quiet, raised her hand. "Is that why she never left the town? Even when she could have?" I smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe she stayed to prove that she didn't have to disappear just because someone else tried to erase her." There was silence, the good kind. By the time the final bell rang that day, I felt like a version of myself I hadn't seen in months. Exhausted, sore, but alive. Present. I walked past the rows of lockers, a few students waving or offering shy welcome backs. I didn't know who knew what. High schools operate on rumors the way lungs use air, but I didn't care. I'd shown up, that was enough. When I got home, Victoria was on her laptop, typing furiously, a half-eaten salad beside her. "You look flushed," she said, eyeing me. "How'd it go?" "I made teenagers care about 19th century shame." She raised a brow. "So, a win." "Definitely a win." I collapsed onto the couch and pulled off my shoes. My back ached. My ankles were the size of tangerines, but my chest felt lighter. "I need to do this," I told her. "Even if just until the baby comes." She nodded. "And afterward?" "I don't know yet." That night, I sat in the nursery. The one Victoria had helped set up, with pale green walls and a mobile of paper stars we'd spent 3 hours assembling. I rocked slowly in the chair, feeling my daughter twist and stretch beneath my skin. "You're already stubborn," I whispered. "You take after your aunt." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "Filing updates done. You're covered for the next 90 days. Want to meet Friday to go over post-birth paperwork? Also, how was school?" I smiled before I could stop myself. Better than expected, a little messy, a little human, like most things worth doing. A moment passed, then another ping. "Well said, Professor Maddox. You keep teaching. I'll keep lawyering. Between us, I think we've got this." I set the phone down and let the silence wash over me. The rest of the week followed a rhythm I didn't realize I'd missed. Mornings began with Victoria's treadmill pounding through the townhouse floor. Days filled with red pens, literary metaphors, and students asking questions that had nothing to do with heartbreak. Evenings were slower: tea, soft music, paperwork. Sometimes Daniel stopped by after work, just for a few minutes. He brought forms, court letters, and once, a bag of groceries that included 3 different types of prenatal vitamins and a mango, because your sister said you've been craving weird fruit. We never talked about Marcus, not directly. But once, as I signed a petition to modify visitation terms, Daniel looked at me and said, "You're doing something incredibly difficult, and you're making it look a lot like Grace." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw that familiar quiet strength, the kind that didn't need applause to stay strong. I'd once believed Marcus's confidence was strength. But real strength didn't need to be loud. It could whisper. It could sit quietly beside you and say, "You're not alone." Friday afternoon, I met Daniel at a small cafe near the courthouse. He was already at a corner table, aligning sugar packets into neat lines. The sight made me smile. "You judge the coffee by the chaos of the condiment station?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. He smirked. "It's a test. Small order helps when big things feel out of control." I sipped my tea. "My classroom has a bulletin board organized by color. I guess we're both control freaks in recovery." He raised his cup. "To structured minds surviving unstructured lives." We went over documents, talked next steps, nothing romantic, nothing promised. But as I stood to leave, he said, "Claire," I turned. "You're allowed to be okay, even now, especially now." I didn't answer, I just nodded, and walked out into the crisp evening air, my coat fluttering behind me like a banner. I was reclaiming more than just my job. I was reclaiming myself. It happened on a quiet Sunday. Victoria had gone out for groceries. I was alone in the townhouse, sorting through baby shower gifts that had arrived early, blankets embroidered with my daughter's name, a tiny onesie with "Mommy's Girl" stitched across the front, and a wooden rattle shaped like a fox. I should have been smiling. I should have felt excited. Instead, I felt the ache again. That familiar pulse of grief humming beneath everything, even the good moments. I was just folding a pastel pink cardigan when my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize. My heart ticked faster. I opened it. "You should know the truth." It wasn't just a one-time thing. We were together for over a year. He said he was leaving you. He just never did. "I'm sorry, Belle." The world tilted. My vision blurred. My breath caught halfway through my throat. A year, not a fling, not a stupid mistake. A secret life. My fingers went numb. The cardigan slipped from my lap onto the hardwood floor. I couldn't move. Couldn't cry. Not at first. I just sat there, frozen in time, my mind racing through every memory. Our anniversary dinner, the fertility appointments, the moment we found out I was pregnant. He was already with her through it all, already lying to my face with practiced ease. The nausea came fast. I ran to the bathroom and vomited into the sink. My knees hit the tile. The cold burned. When I stood again, my reflection stared back at me from the mirror. Pale, hollow-eyed, a faint line of mascara trailing down my cheek. And for the first time, I didn't see myself. I saw someone who had been erased. The front door opened. "Claire?" Victoria called from the kitchen. "I got you the mangoes you like," and she stopped when she saw me standing in the hallway, pale and shaking. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at my phone, still lit with Belle's message, and understood. Her expression darkened. She picked it up, read it once, and said, "I'll kill him." I almost laughed. It came out like a gasp. She was already unlocking her phone. "Better yet, I'll destroy his company. One anonymous tip about his creative accounting." "Don't," I whispered, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. He's still this baby's father." Victoria looked at me, eyes wide with disbelief. "That doesn't mean he gets to walk away from this." "No," I said, my voice cracking. "But this isn't about what he deserves. It's about who I am, and who I want her to see when she looks at me." Silence fell between us. Then something snapped. Victoria swept the neatly folded stack of baby clothes off the bed, sending tiny socks and bibs flying. I stared at her, stunned. "You're too calm," she shouted. "You're treating this like a lesson plan, like something you can file under emotional pain and move on from. Sometimes you need to break things." She stormed into the corner of the room, grabbed the garment bag hanging behind the door, and shoved it into my hands. "My wedding dress." "Break something," she said, voice shaking. "Start here." I stared at it. The satin, the lace, the carefully preserved gown I once thought I'd pass down to a daughter who might believe in fairy tales. I unzipped it slowly. The sight of it, still perfect, untouched, made my throat tighten. I remembered standing in front of the mirror in that boutique. Marcus behind me, hands on my shoulders, saying, "You're going to ruin me in that dress." I'd thought he meant it. With a sudden scream I didn't know I had in me, I grabbed the sleeves and tore. The fabric gave with a sickening rip. Beads scattered to the floor like tears. I kept tearing. Lace, seams, the carefully hemmed train. I didn't stop until the dress lay in a shredded heap at my feet. I dropped to my knees and sobbed. It wasn't graceful or quiet. It was wild. Animal. Years of pain, betrayal, silence, all of it pouring out of me in broken gasps. Victoria didn't try to stop me. She sat beside me, legs folded, and pulled me into her arms like she had when we were kids and I had nightmares. She rocked me gently, her voice low and fierce. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you." A knock at the door startled us both. We froze. Then we heard a familiar voice from downstairs. Calm, composed. "Claire? It's me. I just stopped by to drop off the revised documents." "Daniel?" I scrambled to my feet, wiping my face with a tissue. "Tell him to go," I said automatically, my voice hoarse. But Victoria looked at me, steady. "No. No more hiding. No more pretending." She helped me stand. When Daniel stepped into the hallway and saw the scene, torn lace across the floor, my red-rimmed eyes, Victoria sitting cross-legged in a pile of broken tulle, he didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and quietly began picking up the pieces. "Tell me," he said softly, placing a fallen photo back into its frame, "what you need right now. Not what the law says, not what anyone expects, just what you need." I looked at him. At this man who never pushed, never postured, who straightened sugar packets and helped hold my world together without ever asking for a thank you. "I need," I whispered, "to write a letter to my daughter, to tell her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't keeping it together. It's letting yourself fall apart so you can rebuild stronger." He nodded once, like he'd been waiting for me to say it. He reached into his coat and handed Victoria a card. "My friend owns a shredding company. For when you're ready to deal with the photos." I laughed through the tears. Sharp, surprised. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something close to freedom. As we started to gather the mess, fabric, beads, hope, I found a small embroidered tag from the dress, still intact. It read, "Forever starts here." I held it for a second, then I tossed it into the trash. "I'm not keeping broken promises anymore," I said. "The dress stays broken," Victoria echoed. Together, the three of us began to clean. Not to erase the pain, but to honor it, to turn it into something new, something mine. It began with a sharp pain at 3:17 in the morning. Not the mild, rhythmic tightening I'd grown used to. This one clawed through my lower back like lightning. I shot upright in bed, gasping. The townhouse was silent except for the soft hum of the air purifier. I waited, hoping it was a false alarm, but 37 seconds later, the next contraction hit. Harder. I swung my legs over the bed and pressed a hand against my belly. Okay, baby, I whispered. You're early, but I hear you. She kicked in response, like she was knocking to be let out. I reached for my phone and dialed Victoria. No answer. She had an early meeting scheduled in Vancouver and wasn't supposed to be back until afternoon. I texted her instead, trying not to panic. My hands were trembling. Then I did something I hadn't expected. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. Claire? She's coming, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Pause. Then rustling. The sound of urgency, wrapped in calm. I'm on my way. Call your doctor. I'll handle everything else. Daniel arrived 15 minutes later, shirt half-buttoned, tie around his neck like a question he hadn't had time to finish. His hair was damp. He'd showered, I realized, and he carried my hospital bag over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. You packed this 2 weeks ago, he said as he helped me into my coat. I plan ahead, I panted, leaning on the arm he offered. Teacher habit. Good, he said, because you're about to get a crash course in chaos. The drive to the hospital blurred. My contractions came in waves now, rolling through me like thunder. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other braced near the gear shift, his gaze flicking between me and the road every 3 seconds. You're doing great, he said when I let out a strangled groan. You've got this. At the hospital, the staff moved quickly. Monitors, IVs, paperwork. A nurse asked if the man with me was the father. I shook my head. Friend, I said between clenched teeth. The nurse glanced at Daniel. She trusts you. That's more important. We were settled into a birthing suite with soft lights and wide windows. I tried to focus on breathing, but the fear kept creeping in. I can't do this, I said, gripping the bed rails. You already are, Daniel said. He stood at my side, hands in his pockets, trying not to hover. You're showing up. That's all any of us can do. Victoria burst in 30 minutes later, cheeks flushed, heels still on, blazer half-zipped. I sped the whole way. I bribed a cop. Don't ask. I smiled weakly. You made it. She dropped her bag and came straight to me. Of course I did. She took my hand. Daniel stepped back slightly, giving us space. But then I heard her say, you're part of this too, if you want to be. He didn't answer with words. He simply nodded and moved back to my side. The next few hours dissolved into noise and pressure and pain. I screamed. I sobbed. I apologized for swearing. The doctor came and went. Nurses encouraged me in gentle voices. At one point, I bit down on Daniel's wrist and he didn't even flinch. Then, as dawn broke over the Portland skyline, the final contraction hit like a tidal wave. Push, the nurse said. I did. I pushed with everything I had, every ounce of grief, betrayal, strength, love. I pushed until the world narrowed to light and noise. And then, crying. A tiny, shrill, defiant cry. She was here. They placed her on my chest, slick and warm and perfect. I stared down at her, my daughter, the one I had protected and carried through storms I didn't think I could survive. Lily Grace Maddox. She blinked up at me with unfocused eyes, her lips puckered like a kiss, her little hands curling into fists. She's beautiful, Victoria whispered. She's fierce, I said, tears rolling down my cheeks. Daniel stood silently by the window, looking out at the morning light. Later that afternoon, we sat in the recovery room. The walls were pale blue. Lily was swaddled in a bassinet beside my bed, sleeping with the deep, peaceful stillness only newborns possess. Daniel came in holding 3 cups of tea. Victoria accepted hers with a nod. I spoke to the school, he said. They've extended your leave through the end of the semester, full pay. I blinked. How? Let's just say they were eager to avoid the optics of pressuring a new mother during a custody case. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Translation. He leaned on them. Daniel didn't deny it. He handed me my tea, then straightened the curtain by the window, aligning the folds. I watched him, oddly comforted by his quiet quirks. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a small leather-bound journal. For the letters, he said. The ones you've been writing her. I thought they deserved a proper home. I held it carefully, the smell of fresh leather filling my nose. Thank you, I whispered. Before I could say more, there was a knock at the door. A nurse stepped inside. There's someone here to see you, she said. And then, Ethan. He stood in the doorway, holding a pink teddy bear. His suit was immaculate, his hair was perfect, but his eyes were lost. I just wanted to see her, he said quietly. And sign the papers, I felt Victoria stiffen. Daniel took one small step forward, but I held up a hand. It's okay. Ethan stepped closer, eyes flicking to the bassinet. She's beautiful. I didn't respond. I'm the father, he said softly. No, I replied. You're her biological parent, but that's not what makes a father. He winced, then nodded. He signed the discharge forms the nurse handed him. He placed the teddy bear on the table and turned to leave. I expected anger or guilt, but all I felt was distance. A soft ache, a closing door, not slammed, just shut. That evening, we wheeled Lily out of the hospital. I held her against my chest while Victoria juggled the diaper bag and Daniel checked the car seat straps with methodical precision. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently from the sky. It reminded me of another snowy day years ago, walking down the aisle in a white dress that no longer existed. But this snow was different. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning, a new life, a new home, a new kind of love. And as I held Lily close, I whispered the words I had been waiting to say since the day everything fell apart. We're going to be okay. Because we already were. Mynhet, vidbanting ang volkum vid folkwan 202. ChatGPT Danoi, thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means you believe, like I do, that stories have the power to heal, to inspire, and to remind us of what truly matters. Claire's journey wasn't just about betrayal or heartbreak. It was about rediscovery, resilience, and the courage to choose yourself when the world tries to define your worth through someone else's actions. She didn't let pain define her. She let it refine her. And maybe that's the lesson we all need. That sometimes, what breaks us is the very thing that rebuilds us stronger. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know what part of the world you call home. It brings me joy to see how far these stories travel. If this story touched your heart in any way, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We share stories every week to remind you that no matter how dark life gets, there is always light waiting on the other side. Your next beginning might just be one story away.